Thank you so much, Elvis, and thank you, Elaine, for bringing this amazing art exhibition together for us to experience here tonight. Our next speaker is Kamala Kampadoo, who is professor in the Department of Social Sciences at York University and a former director of the graduate program in social and political thought. She specializes in sociology, race and ethnic studies, and transnational feminist theory, with a special focus on sex work studies. She has published and speaks widely on sex workers' rights and human trafficking from critical anti-racist and transnational feminist perspectives. Kamala has lived and worked in Britain, the Netherlands, USA, several countries in the Dutch and English-speaking Caribbean, and since 2002 in Canada. Kamala will be speaking tonight on the politics of anti-trafficking. One small thing, please, if you're into tweeting and the Twitterverse, please tweet to Migrant SW Justice. That's a hashtag.
Well, it's a great honor for me to be here and to be part of this event. I really want to thank Elaine and Chanel for inviting me, but also to congratulate them on the work that they're doing, particularly Elaine, in building this migrant sex worker organization and project. It's really much needed, I think, and I really do hope that it blossoms and flies in many directions. So thank you very much. So I want to speak a little bit about, and we have a very short time, so I'm going to have to try to cover a lot in a short while. But I want to focus really on just talking about trafficking and anti-trafficking. And the raids in Ottawa last week, I think, are really important for us to think about as to what this means. The raids on the massage parlors were done in the name of anti-trafficking interventions, but yet resulted in the deportation, the arrest or the detention and deportation, possible deportation of migrant women. Now this is a phenomenon that has been happening time and again around the world in the name of trafficking. That sex clubs, red light districts, brothels, all kinds of areas are being raided by police or immigration officials, and instead of giving anybody any assistance, sex workers, particularly migrant sex workers, are actually being sent back home or criminalized in other ways. It was something that was signaled quite early on, particularly around what was happening in India in the early 2000s by Jyoti Sanghera. And it's part of what those of us who've been working in the field of anti-trafficking have talked about as the collateral damage of anti-trafficking interventions and policies. And that collateral damage has incredible effects on sex workers in particular, and other groups in society, and other vulnerable groups. But I want to just say a few things about this trafficking discourse, because it's something that I think a lot of us can talk about, and we hear a lot about, but it also has a very particular meaning and history. So I just want to point out a couple of things. First of all, we should remember that this discourse, the mainstream discourse we hear about trafficking, started way back around the migration of Chinese women into Western Canada and the United States in the 1850s. And it was being talked about as in order to kind of control the women's movements. It was a form of immigration control, right, at that time, to prevent the women coming in to service the male populations who were working on the railroads and in mining, right? That's important to think about. So immigration control was what trafficking was originally about. Secondly, it became in the 20th century, particularly around the control of women's sexuality. First under the name of sexual white slavery, right? And then through the UN Convention for Trafficking of Women for Prostitution, we heard it being talked about in terms of sexual slavery. In this way, trafficking and prostitution were conflated, and prostitution was sort of seen as already and always and already violence against women. So trafficking and prostitution were seen to be almost one and the same things. It then morphed around 2000 and became an issue of transnational or cross-border crime. And trafficking was attached to the UN Convention against transnational crime, and became a protocol to that convention. More recently, or around that time also I should say, we began to hear trafficking being connected to issues of slavery and being talked about in terms of slavery. And we hear about modern abolitionists talking about trying to eradicate the operation of slaveholders, and all of this becomes trafficking, so-called. Now, more recently, and I'm sure some of you have been following this, we are hearing trafficking as a problem of refugees coming from Africa and the Middle East and trying to get into Europe. And what we're hearing from the European Union is they're trying to mount an anti-trafficking campaign to stop the so-called traffickers from taking people across into Europe. Now, this is very, very curious because we know that the war in Syria is the cause for a lot of what's happening. But yet it's being talked about in terms of trafficking. And the other area that we hear about trafficking is in connection with prostitution amongst adolescents, and it's called in the US domestic trafficking. So trafficking has this enormous scope, and it means many things in many ways. And we have to pay attention to it because it sort of grows and it's taking over a lot of things. But in other words, the discourse has consistently been about how richer areas of the world control their borders, control sexuality, control access to the wealth in the world that was accumulated on the basis of some nation states' exploitation, plunder, and war in other places. Right? So that is actually what trafficking is about. It is not and has never been about sharing the wealth, about equality, or sexual or worker and migrant rights. Never. In addition, what we have to pay attention to in the current anti-trafficking movement is a certain amount of racism and paternalism that we see. There's a rhetoric about rescuing victims in the global south particularly, and this is led by Western countries, by the European and the American men, many of them white men. And that kind of movement carries a lot of disrespect for what people want to do and how they want to live their lives, right? So my position is, and I'm going to finish up here because I'm really short, is that we should stop trying to make policies and laws and ideas that are premised on the idea of exclusion and discrimination, inclusive. That we should stop trying to tinker with, at the margins, of a very flawed idea, because the idea of trafficking was actually based on an immense amount of control of working people and working women. And I think we should also not be trying to separate trafficking from work, because even that presupposes this idea that trafficking exists, right? And that there can be something like absolute freedom and sort of enslavement. there's so many gray areas and a lot of mixtures, and too many gray areas that affect many of us, and in fact almost all of us. So what I am suggesting is that we get rid of the idea of trafficking altogether and call things what they are. Perhaps debt bondage, smuggling, migration, and illegalized migration, sex work, informal economies, refugees. Right? We have the terms, we have the names for it. We also have a lot of laws for protection as well as for rights around those different terms and communities. And particularly that we continue to respect and fight for migrant, refugee, worker, sexual, and sex worker rights. And that's my story.